for me personally, Bruce Dickinson is the voice of Iron Maiden. In all fairness, without him, Iron Maiden managed to release some of the greatest albums in metal overall.
Yeah, unbelievable.
So in this episode, following our discussion in community posts, first of all, let's take a look at all 4 Iron Maiden albums released with Paul Di'Anno and Bayley on vocals, and then answer which of those are actually the greatest, despite what many may say. Here you go. The band's self-titled debut is raw, fast, and brimming with this youthful aggression. In a way, on it, Iron Maiden did something very similar to what Judas Priest did on their Killing Machine record, yet with their own twist, introducing the world to a unique fusion of punk attitude and galloping heavy metal, a style that would define the early era Iron Maiden. Musically, the album is gritty. Tracks like Prowler and Runnin' Free feel like they're charging straight at you, showcasing Di'Anno's gritty, streetwise vocals. And here's the thing, he's not operatic like Bruce, but has a snarl that fits the scrappy energy of the early 80s much better than Bruce Dickinson's voice would ever have. And while instrumentally this album is not as polished as later releases, in reality it is actually a part of its charm. Dave Murray's melodic solos and Steve Harris's thundering bass already showcase the greatness that is to come and will be more audible for an average listener on later releases. However, one of the biggest criticisms of the self-titled debut for some fans is that compared to later Maiden, it is a bit primitive. And in all honesty, it is actually quite hard to disagree with this statement. Well, at least until you hear Phantom of the Opera, which has actually laid the foundation for all the great epics that are yet to come. Killers is the textbook example of a band hitting its stride. With Martin Birch at the production helm, everything feels tighter, darker, and more cohesive than it did on the band's debut album. And here's the craziest thing, is that at least half of the songs on Killers were actually around in the band's catalog since the late 1970s. Well, even more, I guess technically, many of those are actually leftovers that did not make it on the band's debut album. And yet somehow they all feel way more polished. Of course, thanks to the incredible job done by the legendary Martin Birch. By the way, for one of the previous anniversaries of Killers, I actually released a special episode exploring how the sound of some of those songs written back in the 1970s has evolved until they finally made it on Killers. Of course, as a part of our Up the Irons series, so if you haven't watched it, make sure to check it out right after watching this video. Because in case of at least some of them, the difference is simply mind-blowing. But anyway, Killers became a direct continuation of the sound Iron Maiden pursued on their debut record. Only the twin guitars of Dave Murray and newcomer Adrian Smith shine even brighter here, and vocally, Paul Di'Anno delivers possibly his best performance ever on this record. And thus I guess it is no surprise that, at least in our community post vote, Killers has actually been chosen as the best and the fans' favorite Iron Maiden album recorded without Bruce Dickinson. Is it so? Let's discuss a little later. With Bayley on vocals in 1995, Iron Maiden had a seismic shift in tone, in a much darker direction of course, which would perfectly fit the feel of that time. Gone are the anthemic choruses and speed-driven riffs, and instead, with the X Factor, Iron Maiden released a much more brooding and reflective record. And here's the thing, the darker sound fits Blaze's voice perfectly, as it carries a gravitas that adds weight to songs like Sign of the Cross and The Aftermath. And in a way, such tracks make the X Factor a complete antagonist of the band's debut record, as each track on it, whether you like it or not, is epic in its own way, filled with haunting melodies and intricate arrangements with which Steve Harris and the team went as far as possible from the early punk rock roots. And here's the thing, those who are not new to our Up the Iron series most likely know that I personally got introduced to Iron Maiden by my uncle with Fear of the Dark. So the X Factor was my first current Iron Maiden album, and maybe that's why it holds a very special place in my heart, and I actually do return to it quite often, even more so than to some Bruce Dickinson albums, like for example, No Prayer for the Dying. And at least to me, the X Factor is actually one of the most cohesive albums Iron Maiden have ever released in their career. And one of the biggest concerns that the fans had when it was released was that it was too current, meaning that it would never withstand the test of time. Yet the funniest thing is that we can actually see that today, almost 30 years later, weirdly enough, it actually becomes way more appreciated even than it was back in 1995. Virtual 11 is where things became way less straightforward. One of the main strengths of its predecessor, which allowed it to stand out among the many, was how cohesive the X Factor was in its darkness. Something that you can't really tell about Virtual 11. Now, I actually of course released a long episode about the history and interesting facts about this album, so I'm not gonna go into the details of it in this episode. But one of the things which I firmly believe why Virtual 11 is actually not considered among the greatest Iron Maiden albums, let's just put it like this, actually has nothing to do with it not having Bruce Dickinson on vocals. It actually has more to do with the whole fact that on it, Steve Harris and the team somewhat tried to please both their current audience and their classic Iron Maiden fanbase, blending the two different genres and styles of Iron Maiden, resulted in an album which in reality did not fully satisfy either of those. But at the same time, in all honesty, Virtual 11 has a couple of really standout tracks, stand out even by the standards of Iron Maiden. For example, Future Real and The Clansman. And here's a weird piece of nerdery for you guys. Well, at least on YouTube, the latter actually has more plays than any song from both Iron Maiden and Killers. By a landslide. Which just once again shows that when Iron Maiden were able to hit the spot, they did it absolutely amazingly back then. So, which of these albums is the greatest, or at least the most influential? Well, here is where it becomes trickier.
Magic.
But before we continue, I just have to point out that, Christmas is almost here, so if you want to rock out our metal Christmas hoodie, obviously inspired by Iron Maiden, Motorhead, Judas Priest, and, a lot of other of our favorite bands, and has a lot of different hints and clues to those records, so if you're a nerd, you would definitely enjoy it. You can still purchase some of them at my merch store, metalpilgrim.net, the link to which of course will be in the description to this video, and just in case if you decide to do that, thank you guys so much, because it really helps me out a lot. And of course this show exists thanks to everyone who purchased my merch and, all the patrons of the Metal Pilgrim show. But anyways, the poll in our community post shows that at least Metal Pilgrims, but I guess all of Iron Maiden fans usually, tend to give the most credit to Killers and the least amount of love to Virtual 11. And this, in my opinion, is absolutely understandable. I mean, realistically speaking, Killers is possibly the strongest of these four records. It has some of the most thought-through composition, which is at the very least much more straightforward than that of the songs on the X Factor and Virtual 11, and in addition to everything, it has something that the band's debut album lacks. Well, good production. So yes, in my opinion, it is absolutely understandable that if judged by the books, Killers should be considered the strongest of these four. But at the same time, I just gotta be honest with you. The reason why Killers is so successful and so iconic among so many of Iron Maiden fans is because it took Iron Maiden's debut album and perfected it. And as much as I love literally every song on Killers, it didn't actually bring much new to new wave of British heavy metal, unlike Iron Maiden's debut. What makes Iron Maiden's self-titled debut stand out is how groundbreaking it was back in 1980. As I said before, on it, Iron Maiden were actually able to do something very similar to what Judas Priest did 2 years before, but did it in a completely different manner. They were able to masterfully blend the aggression of punk rock and the darkness of that time's heavy metal, which resulted in a unique blend which simply exploded among the metalheads around the globe. And it is true that on Killers, Iron Maiden did exactly the same thing. But if we're being very honest, Killers is a follow-up to Iron Maiden. Yes, much more well thought through and much better executed, at least production-wise, but still a follow-up whose main achievement, at least in my opinion, was the whole fact that it was able to help Iron Maiden close their early chapter on an extremely high note and open the gates to a new era of Iron Maiden. As in reality, most likely if the band would have continued down the same path that they did on the first 2 albums, they would never actually be able to become who they are today. One of the greatest heavy metal bands to ever walk this earth. So yeah, if you ask me which album is the strongest of these 4, I would most likely have to go with Killers. But if you ask me to rank them in terms of their greatness and their influence on heavy metal, well, I know that you might most likely hate me for that, but I would go with Iron Maiden as number 1, and I would have a tie between Killers and the X Factor, given slight preference to the latter, actually, because of how cohesive it is, and most likely because of how attached I personally am to this record. And as well closing with Virtual 11, just like most of Iron Maiden fans do. But what do you guys personally think about it? Please let me know in the comments. I'm actually really curious to find out. As always, thank you so much for watching this short video, guys, and as always, thank you so much for supporting me, this show in Ukraine, through this very difficult time. We'll prevail. Slava Ukraini! Look for the truth!